Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming for this year's Berlin lecture. I'm Tim Hitchens, in case you don't know. I'm the president of the college, delighted to see so many people. Our speaker tonight needs no introduction, really. Margaret MacMillan is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Toronto and an Emeritus Professor of International History here at Oxford. She was Provost of Trinity College, Toronto from 2002 to 2007 and Warden of St Antony's 2007 to 2017. She's a trustee of the Imperial War Museum and sits on a number of non-profit advisory boards. Her research specialises in British imperial history and the international history of the 19th and 20th centuries. Her publications have been translated into 26 languages and include Paris 1919, Nixon and Mao, and The War That Ended Peace. In 2020, she published War, How Conflict Shaped Us. She gave the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's Massey Lectures in 2015 and the BBC's Reith Lectures in 2018. So without any more ado, Margaret, welcome.
Thank you. I managed to get the microphone caught around my handbag, which is not a great way to start. I would like to thank the President and the Fellows of Wolfson College for inviting me to give this lecture, and it's lovely to be here again. I think I've lectured here at least once before, and it's a wonderful room. And I'd like to thank all of you for forsaking the sun and the warm weather and coming in to hear about a subject of war, which is rather a gloomy subject. It's a particular honour to be giving the Isaiah Berlin lecture. I didn't know him well, but I met him on a couple of occasions. The first was when I was a student here doing what was then called a B.Phil in politics. And he was one of the examiners, and we had a viva, and he stirred at one point and said, I have a question, very important question for you. And he said, why on earth did you choose the subject of your thesis? And it was a good question, because my thesis, I don't know why, was on the Indian Army since independence. And I think Isaiah Berlin found this a rather odd subject. I myself find it an odd subject at this distance. He himself never wrote much about war. As I was preparing this lecture, I'd look, because he wrote so much about so many things, and I'd hoped perhaps that he'd written one of his many essays or written a letter to a friend about war. He said very little about it, but he himself, of course, had lived through the revolutionary upheaval of the Russian Revolution. He lived through the Second World War, and then, of course, through the Cold War. And I found a letter that he wrote to Lord Halifax, then the British Secretary of State, in 1940, saying, and this was June 1940, so a very, very bad time for Britain. France was about to capitulate. Many British troops and a lot of their equipment was caught in France. It looked pretty grim. And he wrote to Lord Halifax and said, I'm 31 years of age, physically unfit for military service on account of a bad arm and other defects, but offering his services in whatever way he could be used. He said, perhaps in some capacity I can help. And shortly after that letter, he wrote to a friend in the United States, Marion Frankfurter, married to his great friend Felix Frankfurter, saying, I'm prepared to stay here, fight if I can, and die. So he took very seriously, I think, the challenge of war. I only regret that he didn't himself turn his extraordinary mind and capacious interest to writing more about it. I have written quite a bit on the history of war, and it is, as you know, a very long history. We don't know how far back war goes into human society, but it looks, as far as we can tell from the records, both archaeological and written records, that once we began to organize ourselves as a people, once we organized ourselves into groupings, whether clans, family groupings, tribes, and eventually, of course, into nations, we simultaneously, in parallel, fought each other. And I think this is something that we need to understand, that war is not something that is an aberration. It's not something that just happens when ordinary order breaks down. It is not something that happens only to certain societies at certain times. It is something that runs through, as far as we know, a great deal of human history. We've found evidence of mass graves, or archaeologists have found evidence of mass graves, people who were obviously killed in violent ways. We have early records of peoples fighting each other. We found evidence has been found in sites such as ones in Turkey of fortifications around towns and villages, and you don't build fortifications unless you fear some violent attack. I tend myself to define war in a fairly narrow way. It's a word that is used, the metaphor of war is used in all sorts of ways. It's used in our public discourse, it's used in politics. We have wars on poverty, we have wars on inflation, we have wars on obesity, we have wars on any variety of things. But I think when we use the metaphor so loosely, I think we lose something very important about war. And that is that war is a highly organized activity. It is the application of force, including, of course, the use of violence, to achieve your own goals, to impose your will on your enemy. And I think that definition is actually very important because it describes a very particular form of human activity. And it is not something that is spontaneous. I mean, we associate war and violence, but the important thing I think about the use of violence in war is it's determined, it's directed, it's purposive. And when you think of how long it can often take to train people to be soldiers, you take people who don't have the slightest interest often in killing another human being or injuring another human being, and yet through training, armies have discovered how it becomes possible to turn those people into those who will obey orders to hurt and kill others, and also risk their own lives, often against, of course, other instincts that run through human nature, which we've been endowed with by evolution. But I see war as a highly purposive and very organized activity, and I think this is the way in which I would like to talk about it. We have, I think, many of us enjoyed a very long period of peace, and that's not true of everyone from everywhere in the world. But those of us who were fortunate enough to grow up since 1945 in the peaceful parts of the world, and large parts of the world have been peaceful since 1945. The Americas have not had major wars, although sometimes their troops are fought abroad. Europe has been free until the recent war with Ukraine from major wars, although there have been insurrectionary wars and there have been civil wars, as there were in Yugoslavia when it broke up. But for many people in the world, war has been something that has been part of their lives. There have been wars that have run on in Africa, in the Great Lakes region, for example, for years now. Wars in the Middle East, wars in parts of Asia, so that not all the world has enjoyed the great freedom and the great luxury that so many of us have enjoyed in the West. And I think that has made, certainly those of us living in the West, those who've enjoyed what historians are now calling the long peace, it has made us complacent. It has made us think that war is something that others do. We wouldn't use the word less civilized these days, but we would say perhaps less advanced societies or more fragile societies, that it's not something we do any longer, that we have moved beyond it. That is something that many Europeans thought in 1914. They found the idea of a major war inconceivable because it wasn't something they did anymore. Well, it was something they did, and they found they did 4 years of it, over 4 years of it. And we are now finding that war is something that is more present, I think, in our world than we would like to think. And of course, we live in an increasingly globalized world where wars that happen elsewhere have the capacity now and the weapons exist to affect societies which are a long way away from them. We also, I think, have neglected the study of war. It's become unfashionable in many universities, and I'm thinking of North America, where I'm particularly familiar with universities, to study war. It's seen as somehow conveying an approval on war, that if you study it, you must like it. And this seems to me deeply unjust. I mean, the many subjects we study which we don't like. We study the histories of discrimination, we study the histories of racism, we study the histories of oppression. It doesn't mean we approve of those things. But I think war has somehow taken on the aspect of something that is either very boring, it's boys with toys, people talking about weapons, talking about gauges, talking about fighter planes in not very interesting ways, or it is something that is somehow disgraceful to want to study. And that, I think, is very unfortunate, because if we don't understand war, and we don't understand the ways in which wars break out, and increasingly it seems to, if we don't understand the ways in which it is difficult to end wars, then we are dealing with a very complicated world without the necessary analytical tools and without the necessary understanding that we might have. And I think we are living now in a world, but I would argue that it's very important to consider war. We're living in a world in which we have a number of overlapping crises of failed states where low-level but very destructive conflict goes on. Sudan, for example, is in danger of breaking up into several separate states, increased misery of the populations living in countries that have these endless, or what seem like endless conflicts. Libya, Iraq we don't hear much about, but it has faded from the news, but the people being killed in Iraq, the numbers of people being killed, are still significant. And so I think we have a number of conflict areas in the world. We also have potential danger points. Taiwan, the South China Sea. These are places which have the potential for the sorts of clashes, incidents that can lead to war. You have competing imperial interests. I would say China is one of the empires and the United States is another. And where they meet and clash is very dangerous indeed. And so I think Taiwan is a place that's dangerous, or has the potential to be dangerous. The constant and continuing tension between China and India, I think, is something that we haven't really perhaps paid enough attention to, but both have troops up along the common frontier in the high Himalayas, and every so often there are clashes. And again, the danger is an incident will happen and nationalist pressure on both sides will oblige leaders to feel that they have to make some sort of response. And so I think we need to think of these dangers. And of course, we have other sorts of crises. We faced through COVID the problem of pandemics, and we now are told that there are likely to be more pandemics in the future. We have economic crises, we have crises in supply lines, we have crises over the nature of the network of communications that links the world together. I mean, we're realizing that a group in Yemen can cause real problems for supplies coming to countries such as England. And so I think we're facing a more turbulent world, a world which has the potential for conflict, and therefore, again, I think we need to try and understand it. What has also happened, I think, is that taboos that were useful, taboos can be very useful, were useful for a number of years, such as, the one I'm thinking of particularly, that you cannot seize territory by force from another state. It will not be recognized by the international community, and that has been a very effective taboo since 1945, and it's been broken. It was broken when the United States and Israel claimed sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which belonged to Syria, and the United States recognized that. And of course, it's been broken much more dramatically with what Vladimir Putin has been doing, seizing territory from Georgia, and then, of course, seizing large parts of the eastern Ukraine. And so far, those who want to break that taboo seem to be getting away with it. And we know the force of example in international relations. If someone gets away with something, then others will try. And when you start looking at disputed borders in the world, there are indeed a great many of them indeed. So again, I want to stress how important I think it is at this moment that we think about war, that we try and understand it. And I do think we have to go back. As an historian, of course, we always go back. But I think important to understand just how deeply intertwined war is with our own societies. So much of what we take for granted in our societies, organization, bureaucracy, taxation powers of government, a lot of that was strengthened and enhanced by the need to make war. The need to organize for war has helped to build strong central governments. Strong central governments have had the capacity to extract resources, whether it's manpower or equipment, money from their own societies, and to make war more effectively. I don't think one comes first. I think they move in parallel. The more organized and powerful the central government, the more capacity it has to wage war. The more it wages war, the more it's likely to extend its control over society, unless, of course, as in the case of the Russian Revolution, it collapses totally. So as far as, again, as we can tell by going back, and of course the further back we go, it becomes more speculative, we see the development of political and social organization marching hand in hand with wars, each affecting the other, each helping to enhance the other. It is likely, so historians of the deep past are arguing, that agriculture was an important step forward in creating more complex societies and again creating greater capacity for war. because with the development of agriculture, nomadic societies began, or many of them began to settle down. They began to accumulate surpluses, they began to develop hierarchical societies, they began to be able to afford things like scribes, like rulers, like soldiers. And of course, once you develop a settled agricultural community, it's much more difficult to pick up and move. And the great advantage that nomads had was they could always move away. They could avoid war by moving away. It's not true. It's much, much more difficult for agricultural communities. And so we see, I think, as we look through history, the great importance of war in shaping societies. And again, the importance of societies in shaping war. Because another thing that we have to take into account, I think, is that different societies fight different sorts of wars. If you have very hierarchical and very class-based societies, fighting is something that tends to be reserved for those in the elites. In class-based societies, those who sit at the top of those societies, if they do not fight themselves, control the means of fighting. The last thing they want is every citizen or every member of their society to be able to fight. You will often get societies like Prussia, for example, where the landed classes took war as their occupation. It was something that was honorable to do, it was something you trained for, it was something that all young men were expected to do. If they did not go into the military, they went into the state bureaucracy or occasionally into the church. But they developed a sense of obligation to their own society, which was often expressed through going to war. We also see in such societies that the ordinary soldiers are those you don't consider very highly. Officers come from these privileged classes, but ordinary soldiers are those you can afford to lose. And so you wouldn't take, in feudal societies, and in fact up until the 18th century, you wouldn't take a good hard-working farmer and try and make him into a soldier, because he's much more useful growing food that can sustain both the state and the war effort. You would take those who you regarded as the dregs of society to be the ordinary soldiers and the ordinary sailors. Pubs in England in the 18th century used to have signs saying "no dogs, no soldiers." And they were regarded by society as expendable, and I think felt themselves to be expendable. What began to shift in modern society was the extension of society to include far more people. And this was partly democratization, it was partly urbanization, partly the changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution. Not all societies that developed in this way, that turned into societies with large numbers of people feeling themselves to be part of that society, not all such societies were democratic, but there was a much higher rate of participation in society as the Industrial Revolution, the spread of communications, urbanizations, growth of literacy, all these things made it possible to feel yourself part of a much larger society. As Eugene Weber, who some of you have probably read, wrote in that wonderful book, Peasants into Frenchmen, there was a process by which people whose primary loyalty was to their farm, to their village, to their family, were converted bit by bit, not necessarily consciously by the government, bit by bit became Frenchmen, prepared to, if necessary, fight and die for their country. What it has meant is that as war has shifted and as war has become in a way more democratic, that wars have often become more passionate. When you had wars fought by very small numbers of people, when those who were considered worthless in society were more or less excluded or regarded as expendable, then wars didn't engage the majority of those who lived in a particular society. But with the spread of the notion of citizenship, that you're part of a much larger organization, came also the idea that you have some obligation to it. And the French Revolution, I think, is a very clear example of this, when the French revolutionary government begins to talk about the duty and the obligation that all French people, they included women in this, have to support the revolution. The revolution and the revolutionary government belongs to the people, but the people therefore have an obligation to come to its defense. The levée en masse in 1792 says this very explicitly. It is the time to defend our revolution. It is the time to defend our government. But what that has tended to mean is that war has become more passionate, more extreme, that if you are fighting to save your own society against a possible threat, everything from the other society which is fighting you is part of that threat. And so it becomes increasingly legitimate to target not just the warriors of the other side, but to target the whole support system that makes them fight, to target their families, to target the future warriors, the children who will grow in to be warriors, to target the factories that produce the equipment they need. And we've seen, I think, from the 19th century, the spread of war into much greater and more passionate wars in some cases, not all, but in some cases. And a lot of the professional military deplored this. They said, war is getting out of control. We don't want the publics involved. It's much better when we treat it as a profession. I remember reading the memoirs of a British soldier on the northwest frontier. And he said, I think he liked war. And he said, we fight the Pathans, one of the groups in Afghanistan, they fight us, but we respect each other. We don't hate them. But he said, once you get the public involved, the public will be much more passionate, will tend to be much less moderate. It will be more difficult to stop wars. There's a very prescient speech that was made by a great German general, von Moltke the Elder, who was really responsible for the wars of unification that created Germany as a state in the middle of the 19th century. And in one of his last speeches, this man who was an extraordinarily successful general, who had used war, or helped to use war as an instrument to achieve political goals with great success, in one of his last speeches to the German Reichstag, he said he regretted that the age of what he called cabinet wars was finished. Cabinet war, he said, and this is how they described wars in the 18th century, was fought for a clear, defined purpose. It was a limited war. Once you achieved your purpose, you sat down and made peace with the other side. No hard feelings, really, because that you were both doing your job. And the war was over. And he said, we have moved away from cabinet wars, and he said, we now have people's wars. And he said, any prudent government will hesitate to bring about a war of this nature with all its incalculable consequences. The great powers, he said, if they get into a war of peoples, will find it difficult to bring such wars to an end or to admit defeat. And gentlemen, he said to the assembled Reichstag, it may be a war of 7 years or of 30 years' duration, and woe to him who sets Europe alight, who puts the first fuse to the powder keg. And this was from someone who knew about war, who had used war, and I think was prescient, that war was becoming something that was becoming more democratic in a way, more participatory, but that brought with it a terrible price. And indeed, people writing about war in the late 19th century had to think of new ways of describing it. The term total war was in fact coined to describe the First World War because people couldn't think up to that point of how to describe it. Well, this extraordinary phenomenon which drew in so much of the resources of society. So we have seen, I think, a shift in the nature of wars, which we always do. Wars change, they change because of changes in society. And of course, conversely, they also change societies. And one of the reasons at the end of the First World War that the British government, for example, brought in the Representation of People Act was to recognize that both women and the working classes had contributed enormously to the war effort, and to deny them the vote, to deny them the right to participate in their societies was not just wrong, it was stupid. And so even before the war ended, this act marked a really, I think, significant shift in the relationship of women to their own society, the participation of women in the public sphere, and also of the working classes, because up until that point there had been a property qualification. Another thing that will affect war and affect changes in war are changes in technology. And these are often incalculable, but can be enormously significant. I mean, when iron supplanted bronze, weapons became more deadly. When steel appeared, again, the weapons became much more deadly. When the horse began to come from Central Asia into Western Asia and then into Europe, it changed again the nature of war. Fighting people on foot, if you're in a chariot or on horseback, gives you a tremendous advantage. And it took a while for the armies on foot to learn how to deal with this. The horse was transformative in its own period for war. The development, of course, of gunpowder marked another huge step forward. It made possible the destruction of many of the castles that belonged to the feudal lords, who were often enormously powerful in their own rights. If you look at castles built in the period before the modern age, they often have very tall and graceful walls. Tall and graceful walls were not any good against cannonballs. And so later castles, you'll notice, are much, much lower, tend to be dug into the ground because they're much easier to protect against gunpowder. As often when new weapons appeared, there were objections to them, there were attempts to limit them. We're still doing that. With the appearance of gunpowder, various popes tried to say we should not use this fiendish weapon, it's the work of the devil. And then they decided that they could make exceptions, and so they said you mustn't use gunpowder against Christians, but it's perfectly all right against infidels. And I think we're still doing this in a way, and we're still attempting to limit weapons, but we're still in our own minds and our planning making exceptions. And so, again, I just want to stress this long and complicated relationship between both technology in particular, but also society as a whole. I mean, some of the great advances in medicine have been a result of war. This is not the way we choose to do them, but they come about because of the necessity of war. What is not possible in peacetime because it's too expensive or too difficult becomes possible in war because you are fighting quite often for your survival. And you've probably all passed the plaque on the wall on the Woodstock Road just outside what used to be the old Radcliffe Hospital, which says here the first successful use of penicillin occurred in 1941. Penicillin, which has saved so many lives, and its successor drugs, which have saved so many lives, was regarded as much too expensive to produce in the 1930s. No drug companies wanted to do it, no government wanted to invest in it. When the war started, suddenly that became different. And I think we saw something rather like that with the COVID pandemic. What seemed much too expensive at the beginning of the pandemic became a necessity. And so war can stimulate developments in certain areas that are difficult to achieve in peacetime, where people regard them as expensive. We have to accept also that wars have often changed the course of history. We can ask ourselves, I mean, historians are rather wary of alternative histories, but we can ask ourselves, I think, legitimately, what would have happened if the Ottomans had taken Vienna in the heart of Europe, as they came close to doing on at least a couple of occasions? Would Vienna now be a largely Muslim city? Would the center of Europe be much more reflective of Islamic culture and Islamic thought than it is today? What would have happened if the Axis powers had won the Second World War? We would be living in a very different and much more dreadful world, I think. What would have happened if the Soviet Union and its allies had won the Cold War? Again, we'd be living in a very different world. And so I think wars, not all, sometimes wars happen and societies move on and great changes don't occur, but there are wars that I think really do determine the path that history tends to take. And so we think a lot, or we have thought a lot in the past about war, and we've also tried to portray it in the arts. We've tried to deal with the phenomenon of war in any variety of ways from any number of perspectives. We have ranged in our thinking about war and our portrayal of war from its glorification to condemnation. If you think of music, we have martial marches, the Radetzky March, for example, which are glorifications of war. They're stirring, they glorify war, in fact, they were often used in training of soldiers. And then we have the highly mournful pieces of music, like Richard Strauss's Metamorphosen, which he wrote in April 1945, when most of Germany was in ruins, or large parts were, and his own beloved Munich had been very badly damaged. He wrote in his diary shortly after he'd finished the piece, "The most terrible period of human history is at an end. The 12-year reign of bestiality, ignorance, and anti-culture under the greatest criminals, during which Germany's 2,000 years of cultural evolution met its doom." And so I think there is no one reaction we all have to war. There are those who find it exciting, who find it glorifying. You look at the war movies. Some of them condemn war, but a lot of them show it as something fun, something exciting, something that tests people, something that brings out nobility. And it is true, I think, that at least a bit of truth in that, because war can bring out the very best in human beings, and it can certainly bring out the very worst in human beings. You look at how war is portrayed by painters or in tapestries. I was thinking of the tapestries at Blenheim Palace, which you've probably all seen, which show the various victories of the great Duke of Marlborough. And they're quite lovely. I was looking at them again online today, and they have people on horseback, they have soldiers marching in the distance, they have trumpets, they have trees, they have flowers. I couldn't find a single dead body This was not there. This was a glorification of war. This was victory. This wasn't something that you needed to be mournful about or worry about. You have the paintings of David, the great French painter, who was not just a great painter, but was very adaptable to whatever regime happened to be in power. And you've probably all seen his famous one of Napoleon riding through the Alps. This was when he came down and won a series of victories, which really helped to make his name in the north of Italy. And it's a wonderful picture. It's quite heroic. The horse is sort of rearing up. He looks wonderful. Under the horse's hooves are a couple of stones with the names of other great generals, but the horse is trampling on them. This is Napoleon's moment. Alexander is there, but the horse is, trampled on him. In fact, Napoleon did not ride a horse through the Alps. He rode a mule. It was snowing and raining. He was in extremely bad temper. He hated it. He was never very good on horseback anyway. But it was this image, and it was reproduced in lithographs. It was reproduced in handbills all over Europe. It was this image of the glory of war that helped, I think, to build his reputation as the great general. And then, of course, you get at the other extreme, Goya's Disasters of War, which are harrowing. You probably have seen some of them. It shows the bestiality of war, the cruelty of war, the violence of war. They were so incendiary that he never showed them in his own lifetime. He continued to paint portraits of the court in Spain, but he did not show these. They were only shown after his death. And we see the same thing, as I said, in movies. We see it in photographs. There are photographs like the raising of the American flag at Iwo Jima after one of the most ferocious battles in the Pacific in the Second World War, where the soldiers there holding up the flag. I don't think there are any dead bodies in that one either. It was staged, actually. The photographer didn't catch the actual moment, so he got them to stage it again. Many of the things we take as portrayals of war are actually staged or affected or by those who are taking the pictures. We continue, I think, to quiz war, to ask questions about war. We continue to ask, why does it happen? Why can it be so dreadful? And I would argue that in some cases, war becomes very different in the 19th century and 20th century, but some things are the same. And I think the reasons for war remain very much the same. People fight because they're afraid. As Thucydides said, Sparta came to fear the rising power of Athens, and that led Sparta to try, with its allies, to stop this rising power. Nations can fight, or groups of people can fight out of greed. They want something. They can fight for ideas, for ideologies, and often these motives overlap. When the Crusaders went to, for example, on the First Crusade, to the Levant, a lot of them were younger sons. They were going to recover the holy places of Christendom, but they were also going to build estates for themselves, which they couldn't hope to have if they stayed at home in somewhere like Normandy or Brittany, where they were the younger brothers. You also, I think, nations will fight, or organized groups will fight, because they think they can get away with it. I'm convinced that one of the reasons Putin attacked Ukraine was because he thought it would be easy. He thought Ukraine would fold, probably in the matter of a week. You probably all know the stories about the capture of Russian baggage trains, which had the officers' dress uniforms in them for the victory parade in Kyiv. And the FSB, the secret police, had already chosen which luxury flats it was going to take over in Kyiv. Its members had already gone round and decided which bits of real estate they wanted. So we have these different motives. And then we have the questions about, why do individuals fight? And there is an argument that it's somehow evolution has left us with the willingness to fight. I don't think this is true. As I said earlier on, I think a lot of us don't want to fight. We have to be trained to do it. We have to be trained to overcome our natural instincts of self-preservation or altruism, whatever you want to think. We're a mixture of instincts. We're not just violent, or we're not just pacifist. I think a lot of times people fight because they have no alternative. They fight because they see an existential threat. I think a lot of the people fighting for Ukraine did not want to fight particularly, but what can they do? Their way of life, their families, their country is under threat from a power which will, if it wins, treat them appallingly. And so I think sometimes people feel, as Isaiah Berlin felt in 1940, that your back is to the wall and you have virtually no choice but to fight. I think sometimes people fight because they have been brought up to think that fighting is a good thing. We have through history plenty of examples of militaristic societies, Sparta, for example, the Juncker pressure, although there's much debate about that. In China today, I was reading in the paper yesterday, and the government is now requiring all students, both high school and university, to do military training. University students are being brought back 2 weeks early so they can do their required military training. In Russia, I heard a very interesting paper given by a young sociologist working here in Oxford. In Russia, veterans of the Ukraine war are being impressed to go into the schools and talk to classes ranging from kindergarten upwards about the glories of the war in Ukraine and about how necessary it is. And so I think societies and governments can, in their own ways, try and prepare people to fight. There's also, I think, a fatalism. People often say, what can you do? War is inevitable. A Russian mayor yesterday, there was a great victory, well, rather a smaller victory parade than usual to commemorate the Second World War in Moscow and other parades around Russia. And the BBC reporter reporting on this on the Today program yesterday morning quoted a Russian mayor who said in a speech, war is an essential part of human nature. There's no escaping it. It's an integral part of human nature. I mean, there is this sort of fatalism that what can you do? War is always going to happen. And so how do we deal with it? I mean, one of the great problems we face is so often we are good at starting wars, but we don't know how to end it. This has always been a problem. People's fighting wars, armies, planners, strategists, their governments often focus on the war itself with very little thought about how they get out of it. The First World War, those fighting thought it would end quickly. They hadn't really thought of what would happen if it didn't. Yet as it dragged on, surprisingly little attention was paid to how can we stop it. There were a few peace plans floated, but neither side was prepared to talk seriously because both thought they still had a chance of winning. And I think we're seeing the same difficulty now with Ukraine. I think for various reasons, understandable reasons perhaps, there is not much thinking going on in either Moscow or Kyiv about how the war can end. And the great powers who might help to put pressure on both sides, I think, are often preoccupied with other things. We are not good at ending wars. The possibility in Ukraine, I think, well, there are at least three possibilities. One, that Ukraine will sacrifice some land for peace. But the question, as Ukrainians have asked, is how can they trust Russia that will be the end of the demands? Another possibility is the complete collapse or victory of one side or the other, which at the moment doesn't look likely. And a third possibility, which is also worrying, is that it will be a frozen conflict, like we have in Korea today, a frozen conflict that has lasted since 1953, and which always has the potential for turning into something hotter. And that, I think, is a real danger. And then, of course, we have the challenges when a war is over that we do often think about. We thought about it after the First World War. We thought about it after the Second World War. I don't think we thought enough about it after the Cold War. We have the challenges, how do we build peace? How do we actually build an enduring peace? And how do we deal with war so that it doesn't run out of control? Because if there's one thing that's for sure, is war is something that does run out of control. Clausewitz said this, that war has its own logic. You know, you can start a war, you can be very organized, you can say we're going to have a neat little war here, we're going to take this city and that city, and then we'll have peace. It doesn't work like that. Wars will follow their own logic, and they will run out of control, and they are very, very difficult to bring back under control. But when the fighting actually stops, when the guns stop, how do we then build a peace that will last? How do we also try and limit wars? How do we try and bring them under control? It sounds absurd, but this is something we have tried, again, through history. How do we make war something that is less destructive? How do we bring it to an end? There are key issues here which I think keep coming up again and again in the discussion of war, and we're talking about them today. What is the justification for war? Some wars we have come to think, we may be wrong, we've come to think some wars are legitimate, that wars of self-defense are legitimate, but some are not. How do we decide? Countries fighting in wars, of course, will always argue that their wars are justified. And President Putin is arguing that his war on Ukraine is justified in an increasingly baroque and improbable series of excuses. He initially was going to save the Ukrainians from their drug-addicted government, and then when the Ukrainians themselves didn't seem to want to be saved, he decided the Ukrainians had all been brainwashed and were going to have 30 years at least of Russian re-education. He's now shifted yet again and says he's not really fighting Ukraine, he's fighting NATO, and that Ukraine is simply a proxy for NATO. So how do we decide whether a war is justified or not? Thucydides said the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. War is made by those who are strong. Machiavelli said war is just when it is necessary, which doesn't really help us decide whether a war is legitimate or not. We've spent a lot of time trying to decide this as well. We have also, I think, tried to look at such issues, and we will be doing this, I think, again. What is the legitimate use of force? What is the proportional use of force? And this is something, again, we've talked about for a long time. To avenge yourself, to resist aggression, how far can you go? How much punishment can you inflict on the other side? How much is legitimate? I mean, these are not questions I can answer, but they're questions we need to think about because they recur again and again. How do we decide when a war has some validity? How do we decide whether the ways in which war has been fought is legitimate or not? How do we assess war crimes? How do we punish those who commit war crimes? And again, these are attempts that have been made, as far as we can tell, ever since we have had war. There have been attempts to having truces. The Greeks had truces during the Olympics. The church in the Middle Ages tried to impose a truce of God. In a more modest fashion, it tried to say you shouldn't shoot priests. That at least you should spare them, even if you fought each other. How much force can you use? At what point can you attack civilians? How do you distinguish between, in modern societies, how do you distinguish between the civilians who are contributing to the war effort and those who aren't? How do you treat those who are prisoners of war? How do you treat those that have perhaps been caught up in war without really meaning to? I mean, we keep trying. We've had Geneva Conventions, we've had Hague Conventions, we have an international court now which tries to deal with issues of war crimes. We have conventions on genocide, we have the right to protect. I mean, we continue to try and build a body of law and institutions, but very, very difficult to enforce. And we continue, and I think we have to continue, to try and prevent war altogether. Immanuel Kant had a scheme. He talked about the League for Perpetual Peace. And he said, this isn't going to be easy. He said, because you're working, and this is a phrase, of course, Isaiah Berlin liked. He said, you're working with the crooked timber of humanity. And it's not easy to work in a positive direction with such crooked timber. But we need a cultural change, Kant said, where people move away from war, where we move away from monarchies dominated by aristocrats who see wars as a noble calling, who see war as something that can be used, and we move towards what Kant called more republican states, with more participation by people, not yet fully democratic, where eventually, Kant hoped, a league of nations would emerge which would provide collective security. And this was tried after the First World War with the League of Nations, which was meant to provide collective security for its members and therefore discourage attacks on them. United Nations, again, because the war was so dreadful, both the First and Second World Wars, we again thought about it. We thought about how to prevent war, and the United Nations came out of that. And the first line of the preamble of the United Nations says, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind." And I think we have to keep making those attempts. We will, I think, try and make these attempts again, but it will be difficult. And in this current world where there's, I think, little trust among the powers, it's going to be very difficult indeed. As Trotsky said, however, perhaps not someone, Isaiah Berlin would have quoted him, I think, but as Trotsky said, and this will be my concluding remark, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And I think we have to remember that, and we have to try and take a corresponding interest in what it's up to and see what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Margaret, you agreed to take a few questions if you can. So we have a runner with a microphone. So let's go to the gentleman down here to start with, and then the lady here, and then we've got plenty of others. So please, if you could keep your questions brief, that would be great.
And I'll keep my answers brief. Promise.
Hi, I'm a Quaker peacenik, and I'm interested in the Oxford unit, which is called Studying of Changing Character of War. And I produced a blog which had some peace messages in it and was told, well, that's not academic. And it's the changing character. Is it out of hand in the bereaved Russian mothers are now seeing their sons as biological units and not as people? And the drone is enabling you to damage anything you choose without any, as it were, payback, any kind of responsibility.
Well, I think I don't know what the changing character of war principles are, and I don't want to get into a war with them. They're a rather formidable bunch. But I do think you've highlighted the way in which changing weapons can make a difference, and often things that we didn't think would be useful in war. Who thought drones, which people used to use to play with, would become such a crucial part of the war? And it's another example of the adaptation which wars will bring. You take whatever's available and you often change it. But it's a fascinating question, yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Qian, I'm from China. So it's very interesting when you say that the Chinese people is trying to have all the pre-university student and high school student to have the military training. So from our experience, it's actually for those students who have dedicated to studying daily. And they are trying to get this training, dedicated 3 days or 5 days training to actually get them to do exercises instead of military training. So it's quite interesting to see how the Western world, to see how the Chinese, systems works. And so this is my comment. Yeah. I'm not sure how you respond to that.
Well, I think this is very recent. It was something that the government announced that it was going to encourage. And look, this is by no means unique to China. It's happened in many societies. I mean, most British schools used to have cadets, and it was expected that boys would learn how to march, and things like the Boy Scouts. Boy Scouts were learned, their vow was to serve their king and country, and they learned to do things like Morse code, semaphore. I remember learning as a Girl Guides semaphore. I can't remember a single thing of it now. Girl Guides wasn't nearly as exciting. We were expected to roll bandages and put but it is something that the Chinese government has just said that it's going to make mandatory. You can find it on the BBC. You can find it, and I'm sure it's in the Chinese press. So if you go back to China, to a university, you may find yourself doing some drills. You never know.
Actually, I don't agree that. But I have another question. So what is your opinion about all those all the world top universities starting to the campaign for the current war in the Palestine, and they're supporting Palestine side instead of the Israel side?
Yeah. Well, this is a question that would take us another hour to get into, so I'm not dodging your question. What I worry about is a number of these demonstrations are simplifying what is a very complicated struggle and a very complex question with complicated moral questions as well. And to say one side is absolutely virtuous and the other side is absolutely not virtuous, I think doesn't get us anywhere. I think what is more important, and perhaps that's because I'm a teacher, is to try and understand the roots of the conflict and see if there's any way of bringing about the sort of compromise that will bring it to an end. But I sometimes worry that, certainly in North America, in my own university, at the University of Toronto, there is now an encampment on the main campus. And a lot of the demands are not terribly realistic. And I think I would be more impressed if they were doing teach-ins, if they were actually trying to look at some of what's going on. Or more impressed if they were trying to raise money for refugee relief and for medical aid. I worry, and this is probably unkind and it's probably my age, so you feel free to disagree with me, that some of it is just about making people feel good. And you don't have to do very much, and you have a bit of fun, and it's warm weather, and you can be outside. But maybe I'm being cynical, but that's what happens when you get older. So,
thank you very much. If we manage to implement the study of war in universities, please put in the title also the word peace, because I publish eventually a study on the notion of peace in Byzantium and the Middle Ages. This is what I teach here in Oxford. And it's no bibliography about this. It's quite difficult to find something. So please, we have to keep also peace.
Oh, absolutely.
In the title, yeah. So, and I did, I'm an officer now. During my undergraduate studies in a communist country, we did army. So it was compulsory. So I really suffer because of the lack of bibliography.
I think when you're studying war, you are studying peace. If you don't understand wars, you don't understand how they end or how they can end, then you aren't properly understanding peace. And I think very important to understand how peace can be maintained. It's not something you just get, it's something you have to work at. And it often means, I forget who said it now, if you want peace, prepare for war. You can't just assume the goodness of human nature, unfortunately.
Hi, so I'm actually, this is kind of the history of war program corner over here, so, which the Changing Character of War Center is run out of. So I have a question actually about the changing character of war. Going back to what you said about the kind of shift to wars of peoples and, the growth of the state and citizen armies in the mid-20th century, in modern liberal democracies tend to have very small professional armies in terms of the number of people as a percent of the population that is generally not very representative of the population as a whole. And in some ways similar to the 18th century model and in some ways not. How do you think that has changed the way we as a culture think about war?
It's an interesting, I don't think it's a very good development when you have certain sections of society going into the armed forces. I mean, it's something I think that it's a responsibility that should be carried throughout society. And I actually think in some ways conscription is good because it broadens the base of those who are being trained. And so, I mean, we have moved in the direction of much smaller armed forces, partly because of the technology. The argument is you don't need as much. But then Ukraine, as in so many ways, has upended a number of our assumptions. I mean, you look at the pictures from Ukraine and it looks like the First World War in places. People are fighting in trenches. Manpower matters, or person power, because there are women fighting in combat roles, matters. Boots on the ground matter. And I think, there's a lot of thinking going on now in military circles about what is the future of war going to be. Well, you're doing it, all of you, but I think it is something that we're going to have to ask about. I mean, I suspect what we're going to get is sort of two levels of war. We're going to have the very high-tech war. In fact, we're going to have the war in which human beings don't matter much anymore. The latest round of fighter planes on the planning, in the planning stages don't have pilots at all. They're going to be naval ships with no crews, self-directed. And we've got autonomous weapon systems already, which presumably will, as artificial intelligence develops, become more and more sophisticated. But we still will have the boots on the ground. We'll have the people fighting. And often fighting with not very elaborate weapons, or improvised weapons. The improvisation of the drones, or in the Afghan war, the improvised explosive devices, which are often children's toys. I think they were little children's cars, which could be remotely controlled and be packed with explosives. So I think we're at a stage where a number of our assumptions are being questioned. Clearly, development of weapons is going to continue. But I think we are at a stage where we're having to look again at just what sort of wars we're going to be fighting in the future. And they may not be as clear-cut. We may not be as clear about it as perhaps we once were. Anyway, you are the ones who are going to be studying it, so I'll look forward to what you tell me about it.
We have two gentlemen in black ties, both of whom I think have questions. Maybe if you both ask your question.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for the lecture. My name is Vasily. I'm from Russia. First and foremost, I wanted to disagree with the concept of Russian
Disagree
men.
with what? Sorry?
No, disagree with the concept said earlier that Russian men are treated as biological units. Second, used earlier, I think, in one of the questions. Second, I wanted to ask you about the United Nations and the Security Council, because in my opinion, the current conflict and war in Ukraine shows that the United Nations and the Security Council have proven themselves quite incapable of resolving the modern conflicts and preventing them. So what do you think? Do you think there may be some replacement for such organizations that would render their mission more efficient in preventing wars and conflicts in the future? Thank you.
Okay, I have to remember all that.
You want to take Freddie's as well?
Okay, but you'll have to remember them for me. But.
Hello, my name is Freddie. I'm a DPhil student in international relations. I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit about how we can strengthen sort of the normative standards surrounding not engaging in war and also the laws of armed conflict, what we can do to make war more ethical or not happen at all.
Yeah. Well, if I could answer that question, I would, but it's a very difficult one. But both your questions are good. Let me start with the UN one first. And I think the UN Security Council is a reflection of the Second World War, and I think it badly needs reform. Its permanent members reflect the distribution of power at the end of the Second World War. It's absurd to me that there should be 2 European countries on it when it should be represented. The EU should have representation. There's no representation from Latin America. A large country like India is not on the permanent council. So there is a real problem. I think if we didn't have the United Nations, we'd probably want to invent one because it is a useful meeting place. It hasn't fulfilled the dreams of those who set it up, but without it, I think we would be worse off. An idea that is being floated, and I'm still not sure what I think about it, is to have, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, there was something called the Concert of Europe, where the 5 great powers at the time maintained the peace, largely in a conservative way. They didn't want revolutions, but they did help to create a peaceful Europe. Their goals were limited, and they did so quite successfully for quite a long period of time. And there is talk now of trying to build a world concert, which would have similarly limited goals, not trying to transform the world, but simply trying to stop conflicts before they run out of control. Because the danger, of course, of any conflict is it brings in other powers, or it can bring in other powers, and it can spread. And we're seeing this, of course, with Ukraine. And so I think, I think we're seeing it, of course, in the Middle East as well, with the involvement of outside powers. And this is very dangerous indeed. And so I think that it is an interesting possibility. How we rebuild norms, I think, is very difficult. Public opinion matters, but there's also this issue of how once they're broken, it's like we were talking earlier. I was talking earlier on to your president about trust in society. And once trust is broken, how do you rebuild it? When you no longer trust those who seem to be in control of things. Just to use a very local example, we all depend on the company Thames Water. They have lost my trust, and I'm not sure I'm ever going to trust them again. But I'm making a light of it. But you know what I mean? It's just, so how do we rebuild it? And how do we try and persuade people that war, especially as weapons get more deadly, it's terrifying what's being developed now. And I'm sure there are nations working on biological and chemical weapons, even though it's against all sorts of international agreements. War, it looks like, is moving into space in spite of the treaty, which says that there should be no weapons in space. And I think our capacity to destroy ourselves is now so much greater than it was, in 1945. I mean, you look at the nuclear arsenals. I mean, the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are tiny in comparison to some of the bombs that are around. And so, I think we need to bring this home to people. And I think public opinion can help to reestablish norms. But then we've got, we've got other things. We've got other things to worry about. I sometimes think I feel it myself. We can only worry about so many things at once. We're worrying about climate change. The oceans are getting hotter and hotter. What's that going to do? Nothing good. Just to give one example, we're worried about future pandemics. We're worried about economies collapsing. We're worried about supply lines collapsing. We're worried about countries lapsing into states of anarchy. I've talked to Americans who very seriously worry about what's going to happen with this next election. Will it be hotly disputed, including by all those many Americans who have guns? So I do think it's very worrying. But so I think there's a need for leadership. And you still have to deal with the big states. You have to, China and the United States have to find ways they can work together, even if for very limited goals of not blowing this all up. Somehow, sooner or later, Russia's going to have to be brought back into relations with the United States. Its relationship with China, I think, is a tricky one. India has got to be brought in to the discussions of what's going on in the world. I think we just have to keep trying, which isn't a very satisfactory answer, but the alternative is even worse.
I've got time for one more question, so I think one more, I'm afraid, to start with.
Hi, I'm a U.S. naval officer. My question is maybe easy to ask, but difficult to answer. As a student of war, what is your advice to a practitioner?
I would say read history and think about it, because you will be... I think the thing of being a serving officer is you are so engaged in what you were doing at the time. But if you can step back and reflect, as you're presumably doing as you're here, I go down to Johns Hopkins in Washington every fall, and I teach. There's a course there for mid-career military. They take a year out and they do a master's. And I think it makes them better at what they're doing because they step back a bit and they reflect on the nature of war, the purpose of war. They look at examples of other wars. And so I think, the past is not going to teach us everything, but we don't have much else to go on when it comes to war. And I think looking at past wars, looking at the challenges that leaders faced in past wars, looking at the difficulties of making peace at the end of wars is something that I would like to think that the military have people who understand and appreciate that and think about it. So I think naval officers come for a year, don't they, and I think it is really an opportunity for that sort of reflection, which we all should do in our careers, but we so often don't. But I hope you enjoy your time here.
Thank you very much, Lee. Thank you for the excellent questions. Thank you, Margaret, for your magisterial sweeping presentation. I hope you all think it was worth coming in out of the sun.
No, poor things.
This evening. But thank you very much.
Okay,
indeed.
thank you.